I think that a lot of the value that I, in general, bring is being able to bridge that gap. I've been the drug dealer and I can also play the suit, and I'm really like not either one of them at the end of the day. So connecting the dots between two of those and like facilitating both of those operating, right? Because we have salespeople that they were selling to their customers when this was totally illegal. And then we have, the board of directors and the public markets to think about. And all of this is just a matrix of connecting dots and making sure that those things can play well together and communicate with each other and understand each other.
This week, I'm sending you back in the time machine to listen to part of my conversation with Colin Landforce, who is a force of nature, as his name implies. It was a really fun conversation. There's this weird thing that happens as you grow and as new listeners come, that they somehow miss all the great episodes that you had in the past. So every now and then we like to bring some of them back. I love this one with Colin. You're going to hear us trading stories of our early entrepreneurial journeys, the random hijinks and businesses that we built as teenagers. Colin talks about, CD burning, selling things on eBay, promoting parties in high school. There's a ton of stuff. I'm not going to spoil it all so that you watch the episode, but it was a ton of fun. You're also going to hear about Colin's journey building a cannabis empire that ended up being a publicly traded company. That was a really interesting story. You're going to hear more about that. And then we talk about the entrepreneurial mindset, what that takes, the lessons that you learn as you build and scale businesses, especially when you start hiring people, once you start growing, especially when you're growing at pace. I think at the time I was also working at one of Europe's fastest growing startups as chief of staff. So you're going to hear a lot from both of us on that. So I know you're going to love this. You can get the full show notes, the transcript, and read my newsletter at theknowledge.io. And you can find Colin online on Twitter at Landforce, and he'll have links to all his current stuff there. He's since gone on to become a bit of a master at brand. He's doing a lot of stuff in the golf space right now, and I'm definitely going to have him back on at some point. If you love this, please do share it with a friend. And don't forget to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because it helps us a ton to find other listeners just like you. It helps me to know what kind of episodes you love, what kind of guests you've loved, who we should have on next, the kind of things we should cover. Give me your feedback. Let me know. We're always listening and checking these things. So here's the show. Obviously, you've gone viral a few times and you talk a lot about the businesses that you guys run now, but I'd love to go way, way, way back and figure out, okay, where does this all come from? So have you always felt like you've been an entrepreneur? Have you always had that kind of self-starting spirit? And I know that you have this phrase that says like builders build. Has that always been you from like a very young age, or is that something you've cultivated as you've gotten older?
Yeah, I'd say something I've refined, right? So I think, early on, initially it expresses itself as entrepreneurship, but I've done a lot of introspection on the topic and really centered around insecurity of being a jack of all trades, right? Because I am a jack of all trades, and I've certainly had plenty of moments of like, what am I actually doing? What am I actually going to like specialize in? And for me, it all circled back to just creating. And like I think of building as like creating something where there once was not, right? And so in terms of that, like yeah, it started with Legos, right? And then as it manifested itself into business, which is the place where I'm lucky enough to like make a living and have a career building, early on, I think for a lot of entrepreneurs found themselves, promoting parties and this kind of thing. That was definitely probably, I guess, five-figure businesses I was doing was throwing parties and that kind of thing. But yeah, again, for me, it's like it's building is the core tissue there at the end of the day. And the usual CD burning in middle school and all those little hustles that I think are common amongst people of our age. And we ended up here. I wasn't concise. It never is for me, but
No, 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 no. I love not being concise. I mean, yeah, let's dig into that. So, okay, so you're doing CD burning in middle. What's the first hustle that you remember having?
there's a couple like that. The first actual one was eBay drop shipping sneakers. I think was like the first thing. So that was, I'm sure we're all aware of like the fake sneaker world. And I was transparently, so like I was not getting one over on anybody, drop shipping from China Jordans and Nikes that were not actually Jordans and Nikes. That along with the party stuff. So one of the origins, again, going from just like random things into like, oh, this is a business, was when I was in high school, our school canceled all of our dances because they had gotten a little bit out of hand. And so all of a sudden there's all this pent up demand for a dance, a party, right? Amongst, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. And so we threw a party, and that was, that kinda, like, kicked into I guess, a 4 or 5-year thing starting in the middle of high school, bleeding into college and not quite beyond of just, like, promoter, DJ, and event stuff, which got pretty big. We threw, like, some of the biggest New Year's Eve parties in Portland a couple of years. It was always just, like, that business is a slippery slope in more ways than one, and I feel like, especially at that scale, doesn't ever really pan out. Like, nightlife, you can hustle, you can make some money doing nightlife, but it kinda gets into a totally different ballgame in terms of actually building a business there, and it was very transitory for me. It's like I'm in college, I was making better money than anybody I knew in college, but it never was gonna be a whole lot more than that, I think, in retrospect. Those were definitely the early things.
And how were you thinking about money at that time as well? Was it a thing where you were making money and saving it, or were you looking for ways to spend it, or were you thinking about maybe like reinvesting in other things? Was that something you were already having in mind?
I have a very fluid relationship with money is probably a good way to put it. So, yeah, like everything I've ever done is I'm not a saver, right? At this point in my life, sure, I save, but I have a very, very fluid relationship with money. It is something that comes and something that goes. And I generally feel like at any given moment, you could probably strip me naked and throw me in the middle of a desert and I'd be in a decent place 30 days later, right? So all of these things, whether it's just like continue, keep the beast rolling, keep growing and keep it moving.
And so when you went to college, was the plan that you wanted to get some kind of job out of that? Or were you thinking, I mean, you're already making a lot of money, probably more than some people in their first graduate jobs. What were you thinking at that time?
I think I unfortunately went to college just because it was the next thing to do, and I ultimately didn't end up graduating. I think I was a term short. I don't know how many credits exactly, but I went to business school just because it was the next thing to do, and so the reason I ended up leaving is because I just had this moment of, like, I'm not actually doing this. I can come back and do this at any point if it's what I want to do, but I'm going to go actually do things. And so I was reflecting the other week on college, and I think that the professional development class that I took that was really about writing and speaking is probably the most valuable college class that I took. And that class is, not business specific or any degree specific, right? All these things boil down to communication is like the most important skill set any of us can have, regardless of education.
Yeah, I was just talking to someone about that. His name's David Bell. He was a guest on this podcast, actually. And we were talking about how realistically, I think sales or communication and being able to communicate clearly and being able to sell people on ideas is probably one of the biggest, highest leverage skills that you can develop wherever you get that, whether you're getting it doing door to door sales, whether you're getting it in school or selling things, or however you get and however you can build those skills, they unlock so many other things, even writing as an example. So I run this course on like career building and stuff. And I just talk about how learning to write and learning to write well and communicate ideas clearly, even if you're not in a position, it doesn't matter. You don't have to want to become a writer. You don't have to want to use that for the specific purpose, but you can
It's a
apply
life
that in so
skill.
many other contexts. Yeah, exactly.
And communicating and sales are obviously very closely related, and I totally agree.
Yeah. So what did you end up doing coming out of college? Like, how did you find that? Because I can imagine maybe you don't already know exactly what you're going into. I can assume you maybe spent some time experimenting.
Yeah, so immediately after that, I was building media websites. And this was I learned so much through that time. It was such a brutal grind, but I was building music-based blogs basically. There are two of them in particular, and it was a hell of a grind. I feel like looking back, knowing what I know now, it could have gone very differently, but I obviously didn't. And I generally feel like the obstacle is the way. So I learned a ton during that period. But honestly, coming out of it, I was dead broke and ended up just like kind of washing my hands of it. But the next thing I did from there was a text SaaS. So really like before text marketing was what it is today, I did a SaaS around that. That was a grind, but learned a lot there as well.
So were you doing the coding of that business as well?
No, not at all. We had developers, but I mean, do you know much about the SMS space today?
Yeah, I know.
Like,
I know a bit, but I'm
yeah,
sure you could probably educate me a bit
you
more.
fam- are you familiar with Twilio?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. This was before Twilio. So we had burner phones connected to our servers, and we had literal phones sending the text and running our entire platform off of burners plugged into the servers in this tiny little office. So we were like literally ahead of our time, not necessarily in a good way on it, but it was great. We learned a lot, and it's really interesting looking back on like how prolific SMS is in the marketing landscape, and just like I guess not only marketing, right? Things like one-time passcodes and the operation of products, and especially digital products and websites these days is pretty interesting. But we were way ahead of our time, and that ended up bleeding into like an agency, right? Because we it was very hard to make money doing that, and so very quickly, all the people that we were selling on text marketing also needed all these other things, and so it very quickly morphed into an agency.
Hey, we'll get back to the episode in just one moment, but I wanted to tell you very quickly about my newsletter. I started sharing everything I was learning online, and a few thousand people came along for the ride. I send 3 regular emails. Brainwave fortnightly on a Tuesday, which is about the intersection between technology, philosophy, and psychology. Then every week on a Thursday, I send Revelations, and that's about creativity and productivity. And then finally, every other weekend, I send Wayfinder, and that's about decision making. So people in the audience actually send me really tough problems that they're working through, and I help to deconstruct them using mental models and decision-making frameworks. So if you'd like to subscribe, you can join me and over 20,000 incredibly driven people at theknowledge.io. Okay, back to the episode. Okay, sweet. So you built an agency, like a media agency off the back of that?
Yeah, just all the usual suspects, right? Websites, social media, software development, like really just like for better or for worse, the everything agency. And those are a different kind of grind, and did that for a while and ended up just stepping away from it to go pursue other things. But all experience is good experience.
It's so interesting because I think a lot of the kind of entrepreneurial, scrappy types, or people that, like you say, jack of all trades, people that pick things up as they go along, you actually are picking up all the skills that you can leverage later on. So sometimes, even though you might not see in the moment how applicable this thing is, or you might have something that fails or doesn't pan out the way you expect it to, the lesson that you learn and the skills that you build ultimately pay off when you find something that you can apply them to.
Yeah, I totally agree. I genuinely do not ever look at any time I spent on anything as wasted time, even if it didn't pan out for that exact reason. If you're picking up game, if you're getting experience, to a certain degree, that's always going to be adding value, even if it doesn't seem like it in the moment.
So tell me, how does the cannabis thing pan out? Like how do you get into that?
Yeah, so gosh, leading up to that, I was actually at like my only job, I think, as a young man at that point, and that was kind of coming to an end in a lot of ways. And I had a couple of friends that were, as the story goes, selling bulk flower to dispensaries. I was just kind of like looking for what's next, and it was that. So I left that and jumped in, and the rest is history. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I think the year following me leaving, we did like 3.5 or 4 million. It was largely bulk, just moving weight to dispensaries. But the end goal was always product, right? So the early days were just building a distribution network. Without distribution, nothing really matters, right? So building out that network so that we could ultimately sell whatever we landed on into that same network. And so the early days were just building that out and then figuring out what was next. And then we started developing brands and developing products and so on and so forth. And then I think 3 or 4 rounds of M&A later, here we are, publicly traded through a merger, and doing that at a bigger scale than 4 or 5 years ago when it all started.
That's awesome. Give me an idea of how easy or difficult was it scaling in those early days? Because I think there's 2 things, right? So people obviously see your journey and see everything that you've done, and there are people that will want to replicate that, whether it's in the same industry or in others, and people will see that as an example. Was it easy being able to scale the distribution? Also, maybe give me an idea of like how this fits in from a legislation perspective. Was this like soon after it was starting to become legalized in a lot of places? Was it super early, or was it you could already see some examples of what this was going to look like in some other areas?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple angles on it. One is, especially early days, we're basically talking about a low margin distribution business. And those are really hard from a cash flow standpoint. As you grow, you need exponentially more cash and it's low margin, so cash is hard to come by, and that's if collections are perfect and business is good, right? And then you add on to it the cannabis dynamic. And so outside of regulation and licenses and the hoops that have to be jumped through there, which vary a lot market to market, cannabis in open markets, which is what the West Coast, all the West Coast states are open license states, which means that more or less if you want a license and you want to be in business, you can be, which means it's an absolute bloodbath. Like I don't think there are very many industries that are more competitive than West Coast cannabis. And so you add that onto that, and it's absolutely been a bloodbath. It's very, very difficult. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. The advice I do give is that cannabis is exciting. There is, and there will continue to be a huge growth curve in cannabis. And my favorite lane, and if I was like stepping away now, but then wanted to get into cannabis, I would be getting into ancillary businesses that service cannabis, like a marketing agency, an electrician, all this boring stuff that basically has like the same growth potential as cannabis, but it's just the nuts and bolts, right? And it's like the electrician gets paid whether or not the price of the flower being grown there plummets and kills the business that's running it. The electrician who ran the wires gets the check every single time, right? And because you don't get to grow the weed without that. I think there's huge opportunities to just niche into cannabis with all these boring businesses isn't the word, but like run of the mill businesses, right? That's my pitch on the cannabis industry. Stay away.
Yeah, no, I completely get that. It's not always the big sexy thing, right? Like there's so many small niches and so many small opportunities that people often miss just because they are literally looking to replicate whatever it is that they've seen. So one other question that I had is going off the back of what you were saying, which is really about when you're there in those very early days, you haven't necessarily done something exactly like this before. How much did you need to learn in order to be competent? Because I think you see the story a lot of people get onto something good and they don't even know how to cope with it. And there's too much demand, there's too much going on, and they can burn out very quickly. But obviously, you guys were able to keep going for the long haul and actually make it work. And you were able to learn whatever it is that you needed to learn at the exact right time to be able to keep things going.
Right. So I think to a certain degree, that's the nature of any startup because even in an established industry, you don't really know what to expect until that first punch, right? And then all hell breaks loose. So I think startup life in general is kind of built that way. For cannabis, it gets extra special because, you know, I think in the case of us, so like especially early days, but also now a big part of our business is the distribution businesses. And distribution is an afterthought to regulators, right? When the regulators sit down at the state level to go, okay, so we need to figure out rules and licensing for stores, and then the people that grow it, and then the people that make the products, right? Like generally speaking, all the regulation around moving it and getting it from A to B was like a total afterthought. So in addition to, okay, you're learning about the compliance, the hoops you have to jump through, and then you're learning the software that runs that, which is also like pretty half baked. There's also just like gaps in this stuff where there is no way to do it. Right? It's pretty daunting when you're talking about like compliance and regulation to go like, okay, so we don't have a way to do this. So just like do it the same way every time. So once we figure it out, at least we'll know that you were being intentional about it, right? It's like you have a lot of moments like that, even in the sectors that are more sorted out, like a retail. But then even there, right? So you don't get to just use a normal POS solution for a retail store, right? You're using things that are addressing, both the compliance side of the industry as well as just the nuance of cannabis, which there is plenty. That means all these softwares are new. There's not a single player in the cannabis space that's like a big player in software that has been around very long because it hasn't been around very long from a recreational market standpoint, which means that all of these things, all of the utilities that any other industry takes for granted are like being rapidly developed by teams that are generally fighting the same fires as you and like grappling with the ever changing legislation just like you are and so on and so forth. So it's like startup vibes on like 5,000, honestly.
Yeah, I can imagine, particularly within that kind of industry. Did you
Yeah.
find any trouble with, in terms of hiring, like finding the right people, people that were not just there because it was an interesting industry to be in, but people that could actually do what you needed and to help you scale in the right way?
There's a really interesting dichotomy of people getting into cannabis between like people that just want to do cannabis, but don't particularly have any experience outside of it. And then people that have a ton of experience in a thing and want to get into cannabis and apply that, right? So early on for us, our whole thing was not hiring from within cannabis. Our thinking was that you can teach somebody about cannabis, you can't teach them to like show up on time. Right? Those are inherent traits. So especially from a sales perspective, right? Like we wanted to bring in people that were great at boots on the ground B2B sales and then teach them cannabis. Now, fast forward a few years, now it's like I'd much rather hire a sales rep that has a book of business and has existing relationships. So that's kind of flipped on its head. And then in a totally different light, we had somebody applying for a job like on our manufacturing line who had like two master's degrees from like Yale and Harvard in like theoretical something or other. And again, this is just somebody that they just want to be around weed. They just want to do weed, which is just a bizarre thing to deal with, right? It's not your run of the mill manufacturing team member. So it's really all over the board. I think not to give like a cliche answer, but it's kind of boiled down to just like it just has to be right, you know? A
Yeah.
super seasoned manufacturing leader is not going to be able to come in and figure out a cannabis supply chain overnight because there's nothing like it in the world. And so all these things are like you have to find people that kind of like have some of the structure and core competencies from the spaces that they work in, but are flexible and crazy enough to go figure out how that applies to cannabis and how it doesn't. Because nothing is cookie cutter in it.
Yeah. How have you found adapting to the leadership side of things in terms of actually having to help run this company as you're growing? Because I think it's very different. You get two kinds, maybe like two types in my mind. There's a lot of people that, okay, don't necessarily have any corporate experience or startup experience, but they're able to maybe build something small and it stays relatively lean, like in the tens of people. And then I think on the flip side, you also have some founders that maybe they've worked in some other startups before and they've seen things scale and they've maybe worked in corporates or in consulting or something else and they have some of that experience. How did you find that if you didn't necessarily, it's not like you had spent years and years within previous startups to be able to see examples of, like how to lead effectively and how to help the business to scale well?
Yeah, I think that's another place where I think there's a lot of like management skills that can be taught from a leadership and communication standpoint. I think a lot of that is you have it or you don't. I guess technically what might be considered middle management, but I'd like a lot of the leaders in our business have just been brought up through the ranks because a lot of the intangibles, like you need so much leadership on the ground with how fast things change in this. And the reality is that's like not going to come from someone who's like led a large team at Deloitte. It's going to come from someone who knows this stuff, who understands the struggles of the people on their team and the people around them, but then happens to have the communication skills and just these intrinsic leadership skills to piece that together. I don't know. Again, this feels like cliche answers, right? But it's so true. And I've seen so many people come into cannabis with traditional experience in X that just get burned by the nuance and without being able to, not literally speak the language, but like understand the language, the rest doesn't matter a lot of the time at the end of the day.
And so, do you think things have changed a lot? Obviously, like you mentioned, you've had the merger, you're now publicly traded. How different is that to where you'd been before? And obviously, like having gone through that whole process.
Yeah, I think there's definitely just additional layers, right? All the other nuance and complexity still exists every day. And then you have new layers. You have the public market layer. Like as you're fighting through the daily firefights and operating the business and growing the business, there's also this layer of like where's the share price, right? And these kind of things. And I think we're fortunate enough where we have people who like that's how they spend most of their lives. That's not how I spend most of my life. I've learned a ton about it, but I think that a lot of the value that I in general bring is being able to bridge that gap, right? Like I've been the drug dealer and I can also play the suit and I'm really like not either one of them at the end of the day. So connecting the dots between two of those and like facilitating both of those operating, right? Because we have salespeople that like they were selling to their customers when this was totally illegal, right? And then we have, the board of directors and the public markets to think about. And all of this is just a matrix of connecting dots and making sure that those things can play well together and communicate with each other and understand each other.
How have you found building this with also managing your personal life as well? I know that you're crazy about being a dad and having your family and how do you find balancing that side of your life as well? Because I know there's loads of people, when you think of a CTO of a public traded company, there are people that their whole lives get sucked into work and whatever it is that they're doing. And, they have to pick up their phone whenever it rings at all times of the night and do all of those things. So how do you find that balance?
I mean, it's tricky. I'm fortunate enough that, like, nothing else actually matters outside of that little being that I am so, like, fortunate to have in my life, right? So, there are moments where it's an all hours thing, right? And there are moments of, like, conflict in my personal life because of how much it is. For me, the hardest part is just being able to block out the rest of that when I have that time and get present, and how hard that is kind of varies with what's going on in the business and just what dynamics I'm dealing with during the day. But I think, like, the content of, said phone call or getting those emails, the content of those aside, it's not that different from just, like, balancing entrepreneurship where you take ownership of everything, you care about everything, and you wanna be available, whether it's a partner or somebody on your team or one of your colleagues or one of your peers, like, that want or need to be available and not actually shut off is, like, an entrepreneurship thing as much as it is anything else. And at the end of the day, when we talk personal life, I think, like, I have, like, building things, and then I have my kid and my family, and I don't need anything besides those things, which I think makes it simpler. Like, I'm not, like, trying to hang out with the boys and watch the game and all these things. Like, I do that with with my sidekick. And so I think in a lot of ways, it's a lot easier to balance it when it's just two pieces than when it is, a social life and all these other things. Like, I got my kid and I got building, right? And that simplifies it a little bit.
I saw quite recently you did a thread on, I think you were talking about how your barber could make like an extra 40K by starting a small business on the side. And it's funny because you see some of the responses and, okay, I think you get two sides. There's one group of people that are like, oh my gosh, I need to run out and do this. I'm going to start my own pomade company. I'm going to do exactly what you just said. And then you also get people that like nitpick and they're like, oh my gosh, but what about this? What about that? And what do you think it is that people just don't get about entrepreneurship? Because it's not for everyone, right? There are
Right.
plenty of people that were in your situation however many years ago that were in college that would have been too scared to drop out like you did. And they would have been too worried about what the future would look like. They would have been too focused on all these other things. And then they end up just going into whatever job that they think is right and whatever they think is the next step. What do you think it is about maybe your experience or the way you think that makes you able to like take that step?
It's a very existential question. I spent a lot of time thinking about it because it's something that I want to make sure I can instill in my daughter. And not like entrepreneurship, but really just like exactly what it is that you want to do and bring to the world. I want to make sure that my daughter is in a position to do that and doesn't feel blocked by technicalities or whatever it is. And I think that the biggest thing, again, and kind of trying to dissect this so that I can apply it to my parenting, is just I was so fortunate to have parents that never told me I had to do anything except for remember who I am and who I represent and follow through on commitments you make to other people, right? It was never like, "Oh, you need to do sports, you need to take music lessons." It was none of that. It was like, do exactly what you wanna do every single day and just, like, be responsible and meet your commitments. I think that that's kind of at the core of how I ended up here. That along with some crazy tick where I love making things and building things. And I think that I feel super, super blessed to have that kind of at the deep in the deepest of depths in terms of, like, the core of my psyche and personality, and I think it's something that my parents gave me without particularly realizing it, but that's something I try and, like, push onto my daughter, which if you kinda, like, backtrack on what I just said is, like, push nothing. Like, my kid will be exactly what she wants to be and nothing else, and so when I see that kind of stuff, like, I think it's fear if I had to diagnose it. I used to have this really, like, flippant and, like, kind of asshole reaction to it. But I think at the end of the day, it's people that are like overcomplicating those things are just like figuring out why all the reasons why that wouldn't actually work, which is a huge bummer, I think, at the end of the day. It's also like you said, like making things isn't for everybody. Like there has to be accountants too, and it's fine.
I think that's really powerful, and I'm glad that you are taking that approach with your daughter because I think not everyone gets that. Just like you say, so many people are driven by fear. I think it's a real societal thing that we are taught that there's pretty much one way to go through life, and I think it's the scarcity of like how much time you have, right? So you don't want to make a mistake. You want to get everything right. You want to pick the options that you think will give you the least possibility of failure. And so with entrepreneurship, with building things, there is a big opportunity for failure. But
Right.
I mean, I guess it's about there's a big opportunity for success, but there's also a big opportunity to fail. And you might have to restart. You might even like you shared, like there's a few different things that you've tried. Some of them haven't panned out exactly the way you want them to, but eventually you can strike gold and you can find something that works, and you can scale it. You can apply all of those lessons that you've been building up. But I think unless you are willing to make that bet and to at least try, then you won't have either. You can't have the big success if you're not willing to risk the big failure. And it's the same even with investing, right? Like if there's a lot of people that want to make big money, let's say on crypto or in whatever area, but they are not comfortable with big losses. People lose like, they want to have 20, 50% margin in terms of like their investment going up. But if their investment goes down like
Right.
10%,
We're selling. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
they're selling.
I think, on one hand, it's risk profile, right? Like I have a very, very different risk profile in terms of like what I'm comfortable with than anybody else. Then to go a little bit deeper than that, it's like, what is risk? I don't care if I try something and fail. It's like it is like not an important part of my life, right? And I think that guides that risk tolerance that like what is failing. The investment example is like obviously very, very different. But for me in trying something, it's like I don't have my self-confidence wrapped up in whether or not idea X works. So in a lot of cases, there's like very little, if any, risk at all. And then you add on top of that I have a very high tolerance for risk, and it's like, yeah, why not go to the moon, right?
So is there anything else you're interested in building? I know you mentioned that you're helping with your wife's ecom business.
Yeah, for better or for worse, there's almost nothing I'm not interested in building. My wife's business is crushing it. I'm very thankful that that has, me weighing in or having opinions and helping here and there has not created strain on our relationship, because it certainly could. But she's taking it at her speed. It's going well. I tell her at least once a week that this is $1 million a year business and we need to pour some gas on the fire and make it happen. She's like learning stuff every day and figuring it out and taking her own approach to it. And it's awesome. She's having a lot of luck with TikTok. It's driving all of her growth right now, and it's cool to watch.
What she's selling?
So my wife is half Chinese, and we got totally lucky in finding this thing, but it is a lot of people of Eastern Asian descent have like a missing enzyme or something where when they drink alcohol, they turn red. And they also, in addition to turning red, it's like a bunch of other bad things happen, right? Like it's like a immediate hangover and X and Y and Z. She could tell you all about it. And so she has this patch product, a topical patch product that basically is packed with vitamins to counteract that. And so it varies drastically on people that try it. And actually there are a lot of Caucasian folks that also deal with this. It's just predominantly Eastern Asian. But basically you put that sucker on before you drink. And for some people it's night and day. For some people it helps a little bit. We totally randomly stumbled into buying it from a kid who had created it. And she's been dealing with this since she was in college and first started drinking. And we're not drinkers by any means, but it's like for a lot of people, it's like literally like you take a sip of wine and like you start glowing and you get a headache immediately. And so it's a pretty incredible product for the people it works for. And it lines right up with something she knows very well. So it's really a perfect ecom business for her.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do stay tuned for more. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps the podcast. And follow me on Twitter. Feel free to shoot me any thoughts. See you next time.